The morning mist clung to the rocky valley like ghostly fingers, obscuring the jagged cliffs that surrounded the small hunter-gatherer band's temporary camp. Kira pressed her small body against the cold stone wall of the shallow cave, watching as her father, Thane, prepared his hunting spear with careful, deliberate movements. His thick, weathered hands worked the stone point, sharpening it against a rough granite surface with practiced precision that spoke of countless mornings just like this one. The cave that sheltered their band was little more than a deep indentation in the cliff face, but it provided protection from the harsh winds that swept down from the mountains and the predators that prowled the valley floor at night. Animal hides hung from crude wooden frames, serving as windbreaks and privacy screens, while the acrid smoke from their central fire pit created a haze that stung the eyes but kept insects and small scavengers at bay. "Stay close to the fire today, little spark," Thane said without looking up, his deep voice carrying the weight of authority that came naturally to the band's most skilled hunter. His heavy brow ridge cast shadows over his dark eyes, and his robust frame filled the cave entrance like a protective barrier against the world beyond. The primitive clothing he wore, carefully worked animal skins bound with sinew and decorated with carved bone ornaments, marked his status as a provider and protector within their small community. Kira nodded, but her stomach twisted with an unease she couldn't name. At 7 years old, she had already learned to read the subtle signs that preceded danger. The way the adults moved with extra caution, how their voices dropped to hushed whispers, the tension that seemed to hang in the air like the acrid smoke from their fire. Her young mind, shaped by the constant awareness of survival that defined their existence, picked up on these signals with an instinct that had been honed by generations of ancestors who lived or died by their ability to sense approaching threats. "The Redstone Band has been moving closer," whispered Mira, Kira's mother, as she ground seeds between two flat stones, the rhythmic crushing sound punctuating her words. Her strong shoulders hunched forward as she worked, and worry lines creased her weather-beaten face. The calluses on her hands spoke of countless hours spent gathering, preparing, and preserving food for the band. Jorik saw their fire smoke yesterday, beyond the eastern ridge. 3 columns of smoke, maybe more. Old Bren, the band's elder and keeper of ancient knowledge, stirred the embers with a blackened stick, his movements slow but purposeful. His greying hair hung in matted strands around his deeply lined face, and when he spoke, his voice carried the wisdom of countless seasons and the memory of conflicts that had shaped the very survival of their lineage. "The drought has made prey scarce for all of us. When the streams run low and the animals move to distant waters, hungry bands do desperate things. I've seen it before in the time of the burning sky, when ash fell like snow." Thane tested the point of his spear against his thumb, drawing a small bead of blood that he wiped against his skin without concern. "Desperate or not, this valley is ours. My father hunted these grounds, and his father before him. The bones of our ancestors rest in the sacred cave above. We don't yield our territory to wanderers and raiders." He stood to his full height, his primitive clothing of animal skins and bone ornaments, marking him as a hunter of considerable skill and status within the band. The valley that stretched below their cave had provided for Thane's family for 3 generations. Its rocky walls offered protection, its stream provided fresh water, and its scattered groves of hardy trees bore nuts and fruits that supplemented the meat brought back by the hunters. But now, with the prolonged drought that had lasted through 2 full seasons, even their traditional territory was showing signs of strain. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the stark beauty of the landscape, Thane gathered the other hunters. Jorik, a lean and quick-moving tracker whose sharp eyes could spot game sign from impossible distances, and Grom, whose massive frame and scarred arms spoke of many successful encounters with large game and the occasional predator that threatened the band. The 3 men represented the band's primary protection and food providers, their departure always leaving the remaining members vulnerable but hopeful. Kira watched from the cave mouth as her father led the small hunting party down the narrow trail that wound between the boulders toward the valley floor. His confident stride and the way he held his spear suggested he feared nothing. But she had seen the concerned glances he exchanged with the other adults when he thought she wasn't watching. There was something different about this morning, something that made the familiar routine feel weighted with unspoken danger. The valley spread below them like a vast bowl carved from stone and earth, its floor dotted with sparse vegetation and the occasional cluster of stunted trees that had managed to survive the harsh conditions. In the distance, a small stream caught the sunlight, its waters reduced to a trickle but still essential to their survival in this harsh landscape. It was beautiful in its wild, untamed way, but Kira knew that beauty could quickly turn deadly. The sun had reached its highest point in the sky when the distant sound of voices carried across the valley floor, causing every member of the remaining band to freeze in their activities. Kira looked up from the colorful stones she had been arranging near the fire, her small hands instinctively reaching for her mother's arm. The voices were too far away to understand, but their tone carried an unmistakable edge of aggression that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Mira immediately dropped the plant roots she had been cleaning and moved to the cave entrance, her weathered face tense with concern. "Bren," she called softly to the old man, who was already struggling to his feet with the aid of his walking stick. "How many do you count?" The elder's experienced eyes scanned the valley below, his gnarled hands shading his brow as he studied the approaching figures. 7. No. 8. They move like hunters, but they carry themselves wrong. Too bold, too careless. These are not men tracking game. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen many conflicts and knew the difference between purposeful hunting and something far more dangerous. As the figures drew closer, their features became more distinct. They were indeed members of another hunter-gatherer band, their bodies marked by the same robust build and heavy brow ridges that characterized all the peoples of their time. But their clothing was different, decorated with red ochre markings that identified them as the Redstone Band that had been spotted the day before. Their spears were held not as tools for hunting, but as weapons ready for conflict. "Where are our men?" whispered Naya, the band's other adult female, as she gathered her 2 young children close to her side. Her husband Grom was among the hunters who had departed with Thane, leaving her to help protect the vulnerable members of their small community. The fear in her voice was unmistakable, but beneath it lay the steel determination of a mother prepared to defend her offspring. Kira felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the strangers approach. Something about their formation, the way they moved with predatory confidence, told her that this was not a friendly visit between neighboring bands seeking to trade or share information about game movements. These men had come with a specific purpose, and every instinct she possessed screamed that this purpose boded ill for her family. The lead figure among the approaching band was a tall, heavily muscled man, whose scarred face and elaborate bone ornaments marked him as a seasoned warrior and leader. His hair was bound with leather strips decorated with small stones, and the red ochre painted across his forehead in intricate patterns spoke of status and achievement within his group. Behind him walked 7 other men, their own weapons and adornments suggesting they were experienced fighters rather than simple hunters seeking new territory. "We need to retreat deeper into the cave," Bren whispered urgently. But even as he spoke, they all knew it was too late. The strangers had already spotted their fire smoke and were adjusting their path to climb directly toward their position. To flee now would only invite pursuit, and with children and an elderly man among them, they had no hope of outrunning healthy adult hunters. As the Redstone Band reached the base of the cliff path that led to their cave, their leader raised his spear in what might have been either a greeting or a threat. His voice, when he called out, carried easily across the rocky terrain, its tone deceptively friendly but underlaid with unmistakable menace. "Greetings, cave dwellers," he shouted, his words echoing off the stone walls. "I am Korak of the Redstone Band. We seek shelter and food, and we have heard that this place provides both in abundance." His smile revealed teeth that had been filed to sharp points, a practice common among some bands as a mark of fierceness in battle. Mira stepped forward, positioning herself protectively in front of Kira, while keeping her voice steady and diplomatic. "Welcome, travelers. I am Mira, and this is our family's shelter. Our hunters are away seeking game, but we can offer you water from our spring and share what food we have." Her words were carefully chosen, acknowledging the visitors while also making it clear that the cave was already claimed and that armed men would return. Korak's eyes swept across the cave entrance, taking in the arrangement of their belongings, the quality of their tools and weapons left behind, and most importantly, the composition of those present. His gaze lingered longest on old Bren, whose stooped posture and obvious frailty marked him as potentially valuable for his knowledge, and on the children, who represented both vulnerability and future strength for any band. "Water and food are generous offers," Korak replied, beginning the slow climb up the narrow path toward their shelter. "But we seek more than temporary hospitality. This valley has good hunting, fresh water, and defensible positions. It would serve our needs well as a permanent home. The implicit threat in his words was unmistakable. He was not asking for permission, but rather announcing his intention to claim their territory. As the 8 strangers drew closer, Kira could see the details of their weapons and the confident way they carried themselves. These were not desperate refugees fleeing some disaster, but rather opportunistic raiders who had identified a target they believed they could overwhelm. The drought that had made resources scarce throughout the region had apparently driven them to seek new territory through conquest rather than negotiation. Old Bren stepped forward, his walking stick planted firmly in the ground, as he drew himself up to his full, if diminished, height. Despite his age and obvious physical limitations, there was something in his bearing that commanded respect, even from these hardened intruders. "Young warrior," he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom, "this valley has been home to our bloodline for 3 generations. Our dead rest in the sacred cave above, and our children have learned their first steps on these stones. What you seek cannot be simply taken. It must be earned through respect and proper challenge." Korak's laugh was sharp and cold as it echoed off the cave walls, his filed teeth glinting in the afternoon sunlight. He had reached the cave entrance now, close enough that Kira could smell the smoke and sweat that clung to his weathered animal skins. The other members of his band formed a loose semicircle behind him, effectively blocking any escape route while maintaining the pretense of a casual visit. "Respect and proper challenge?" Korak repeated, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "Old man, your words carry the weight of bygone times. In this age of drought and scarcity, the strongest take what they need, and the weak adapt or perish." He gestured broadly at the valley below them, his scarred hands encompassing the entire territory that had sustained Kira's family for generations. "This land will serve my band well, and your traditions are bones to be buried with your ancestors." Bren's grip on his walking stick tightened, but his voice remained steady and dignified. "Traditions exist because they work, young one. They create order where chaos would destroy us all. If you wish to claim this valley, then face our strongest in single combat, as has been done since our people first learned to make fire. Honor demands nothing less." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a stone blade. Kira pressed herself against her mother's side, feeling Mira's protective arm encircle her shoulders, while her other hand moved slowly toward the small flint knife that hung from her belt. Naya had moved her children to the back of the cave, but her own hand rested on a heavy digging stick that could serve as a weapon if necessary. Korak's expression shifted from amusement to something darker, more predatory. "Your strongest, you say? And where might this mighty warrior be? Off chasing shadows in the grasslands while leaving his family unprotected?" He took a step closer to Bren, his massive frame casting a shadow over the elderly keeper of wisdom. "The drought has taught us that waiting for proper challenges is a luxury we can no longer afford. My father is Thane, the greatest hunter in 3 valleys," Kira found herself saying, the words tumbling out before fear could stop them. Her small voice seemed impossibly tiny in the presence of these menacing strangers, but something deep inside her refused to let her father's reputation be dismissed so casually. "He has killed the great cave bear and tracked the woolly mammoth across the frozen waste. He fears no one." The raiders turned their attention to her, and Kira felt her heart hammering as 8 pairs of eyes focused on her small form. Korak crouched down to bring himself closer to her level, his scarred face breaking into what might have been intended as a reassuring smile, but instead looked distinctly threatening. "Ah, the great Thane's little cub speaks," he said, his voice taking on a mocking tone that made Kira's cheeks burn with anger and embarrassment. "Tell me, small one, what happens when the great hunter returns to find his den occupied by new masters? Does he challenge 8 warriors alone, or does he bow his head and seek shelter elsewhere?" "He fights," Kira replied without hesitation, though her voice trembled with the effort of maintaining her courage. "And he wins, because he protects what matters to him." Korak's laughter was joined by the chuckles of his companions, creating a chorus of mockery that filled the cave and made Kira feel smaller than ever. But even as humiliation burned in her chest, she noticed something else, a flicker of uneasiness in some of the raiders' eyes. They had clearly expected to find only frightened refugees, not a community willing to defend itself. "The child has spirit," admitted Grax, one of Korak's lieutenants, a lean man whose left arm bore the distinctive scars of an old encounter with a large predator. "But spirit doesn't sharpen spears or strengthen throwing arms. When their hunter returns, he'll find a choice: submit to our leadership or watch his family suffer the consequences of his pride. Mira stepped forward, her maternal instincts finally overriding diplomatic caution. You speak of taking our home as if it were simply a matter of walking through our door, but this valley has been defended before, against bands larger and more experienced than yours. The bones of those who tried to claim it by force rest in the vulture grounds beyond the eastern ridge. The threat in her words was unmistakable, and several of the raiders shifted uncomfortably. They had clearly done some reconnaissance before approaching the cave, but perhaps they had not fully investigated the history of conflicts in this region. The mention of previous failed attempts to conquer the valley introduced an element of doubt into what they had assumed would be a simple takeover. Korak's expression hardened at this challenge to his authority. Bold words from a woman whose protector is absent, but words are wind, and we are the storm. He stood to his full height and turned to address his followers. Secure the cave, post guards on the paths. When this legendary Thane returns, he'll find his choices much simpler than his family believes. As the raiders moved to carry out their leader's orders, Old Bren took a careful step forward, his walking stick tapping against the stone floor. There is another way, he said quietly, his words carrying just far enough to reach Korak's ears. If you truly believe your band is superior to ours, prove it through the ancient trials. Combat between champions, tests of skill and wisdom, challenges that demonstrate worthiness to lead. Win fairly, and even I will acknowledge your right to this place. Korak paused in his instructions, his head turning to study the old man with new interest. There was something in Bren's tone, a confidence that seemed out of place given their desperate situation, that gave the raider leader pause. And if we refuse your ancient games? Bren's smile was thin but unmistakably confident. Then you mark yourselves as cowards who can only win through numbers and intimidation. Word of such behavior spreads quickly among the bands, and cowards find few allies when their own time of need arrives. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western ridge when the sound of returning footsteps echoed from the valley floor. Kira's heart leaped with hope and relief as she recognized the familiar rhythm of her father's confident stride, accompanied by the lighter steps of Jorik and the heavy tread of Grom. But her joy quickly turned to horror as she realized the hunters were walking directly into a trap. Korak's men had positioned themselves strategically along the narrow path that led up to the cave, hidden behind boulders and rock formations that provided perfect concealment from anyone approaching from below. The raider leader himself crouched near the cave entrance, his spear held ready, while his eyes tracked the approaching hunters with predatory patience. Signal your men to surrender, Korak whispered harshly to Mira, his scarred face twisted with anticipation. Call down to them that you are safe, but that they must lay down their weapons. Do this, and no blood need be shed today. Mira's face was pale with anguish, but she shook her head firmly. I will not be the lure that leads my husband into your snare. If you want him, you'll have to take him through honest combat, not trickery and ambush. Korak's expression darkened with anger, but before he could respond, Thane's voice called up from the valley floor. Mira! Kira! We return with good fortune. Grom has brought down a young elk, and the stream beyond the northern ridge still flows clean. His words carried the satisfaction of a successful hunt and the anticipation of sharing his success with his family. The sound of her father's voice filled Kira with desperate longing and terrible fear. She wanted to cry out, to warn him of the danger that waited above, but Grax had moved behind her and now held a rough hand over her mouth while his other arm encircled her small body. The taste of dirt and sweat from his palm made her stomach lurch, but she forced herself to remain still, knowing that any struggle might provoke him to violence. As the three hunters climbed the winding path, their conversation carried clearly in the crisp air. They spoke of the elk they had successfully tracked and killed, of promising signs that game was beginning to return to their traditional hunting grounds, and of their plans to smoke the meat for the coming winter. Their voices held the easy camaraderie of men who had faced danger together and emerged victorious, completely unaware of the greater peril that awaited them. The antlers will make good tools, Jorik was saying as they approached the final bend in the path, and the hide is thick enough for winter clothing. We've done well today, despite the drought. Thane provides for his family, Grom replied, his deep voice rumbling with satisfaction. As always, his tracking led us to success where other hunters find only empty trails. When Thane finally rounded the last outcropping and came within sight of the cave, he froze instantly, his hunter's instincts recognizing the wrongness of the scene before him. The positions of the strangers, the tension in his wife's posture, the way his daughter was being held by an armed warrior. All of it registered in his experienced mind within a single heartbeat. "Release my family," Thane said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm that preceded violence. His own spear was already shifting to a combat grip, while behind him Jorik and Grom moved into supporting positions without needing any verbal communication. "Whatever dispute you have is with me. They are not part of this conflict." Korak rose from his concealment, his filed teeth bared in a predatory grin. "The great Thane arrives at last. Your reputation travels far, Hunter, but today it serves only to make this victory more satisfying." He gestured to his hidden men, who emerged from their positions to reveal the full extent of their numerical advantage. 8 against 3, even legends must bow to simple mathematics. Thane's eyes quickly assessed their tactical situation, noting the positions of the enemies, the limited escape routes and the vulnerability of his family members. His jaw tightened as he realized the hopelessness of their position, but his spear remained steady, and his stance showed no sign of submission. "What do you want?" he asked, though the answer was already clear from the raiders' confident positioning and their leader's arrogant bearing. "This valley, this cave, everything you call yours," Korak replied matter-of-factly. "The drought has made territory precious, and the strong take what they need from the weak. Your family may remain as our servants, or they may leave to find shelter elsewhere. The choice is yours." The moment stretched taut between them, filled with the potential for explosive violence. Thane's reputation as a warrior was well-deserved, and even outnumbered he might have chosen to fight rather than submit. But Kira could see the calculation in his eyes as he looked at her mother, at the elderly Bren who had become like a grandfather to her. His love for them was stronger than his pride. "I challenge you to single combat," Thane said formally, his voice carrying across the rocky terrain. "By the old laws, the strongest leads. If I defeat you, your band leaves our territory and does not return. If you defeat me, we acknowledge your right to rule here." Korak's laughter was sharp and mocking. "The old laws? In times of plenty, perhaps such niceties have meaning. But these are desperate times, and desperate times require practical solutions." He raised his spear in a signal to his men. "Take them." The attack came swift and coordinated, with Korak's warriors rushing the 3 hunters from multiple angles, while others moved to secure the family members in the cave. Thane fought with the fury of a father protecting his children, his spear finding its mark twice before sheer numbers overwhelmed him. Jorik and Grom battled desperately beside him, but against 8 experienced warriors, the outcome was inevitable from the beginning. When the dust settled, all 3 hunters lay bound with leather strips, their weapons confiscated and their pride shattered. Thane's face was bloodied from a blow that had stunned him into submission, while Jorik nursed a clearly broken arm, and Grom bore a deep gash across his ribs that would need immediate attention to prevent infection. "So ends the legend of the great Thane," Korak announced triumphantly, standing over his captives with obvious satisfaction. "Tomorrow we will divide this territory among our families, and these former owners will learn what it means to serve those strong enough to take what they desire." The night brought a cold that seemed to seep into Kira's bones as she huddled against her mother's side, watching the raiders celebrate their easy victory around what had once been her family's fire. The flames that had always provided warmth and comfort now cast dancing shadows on the faces of strangers, men who spoke in harsh whispers about dividing territory and resources that had never belonged to them. Thane sat bound against the far wall of the cave, his wrists secured behind his back with strips of hide that had been pulled tight enough to cut off circulation. Blood had dried in dark streams from the wound on his forehead, and his usually proud bearing was diminished by defeat and helplessness. But his eyes remained alert, constantly scanning for any opportunity to protect his family or escape their captivity. Korak lounged near the fire like a conqueror in his new throne room, gnawing on strips of meat from the elk that Thane's own hunting party had provided. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present. The captors were feasting on food obtained through their prisoners' skill and effort, while the hunters who had risked their lives for the hunt now watched their hard-won provisions disappear into the mouths of their enemies. "The meat is good," Korak announced loudly, his words clearly intended to humiliate his captives. "Perhaps we'll keep the hunter alive to continue providing for us. A tame bear can be more useful than a dead one, as long as his claws remain properly trimmed." Grax, who had been posted as a guard near the cave entrance, chuckled at his leader's crude humor. "The woman knows how to prepare food, and the old man might have value if he truly knows the ancient lore. Even the child could be useful once she grows larger and stronger. The casual discussion of her family's fate, as if they were mere possessions, filled Kira with a rage that burned hotter than the fire itself. These strangers had invaded their home, captured her father through treachery rather than honest combat, and now spoke of enslaving her entire family as if they were domesticated animals, rather than free people with rights and dignity. As the night deepened and most of the raiders settled into sleep, leaving only 2 guards to watch their prisoners, Kira found herself unable to remain silent any longer. The anger and desperation that had been building inside her throughout the day finally reached a point where her young voice could no longer be contained, regardless of the consequences. She stood slowly, her small form trembling with emotion, but her spine straight with determination that surprised even herself. The movement caught the attention of the guards, who looked at her with mild curiosity rather than concern. After all, what threat could a 7-year-old child possibly pose to experienced warriors? "Korak!" she called out, her voice stronger than she had expected, despite the fear that made her heart race. "I want to speak with you." The raider leader stirred from his comfortable position near the fire, his scarred face showing amusement at this unexpected interruption of his rest. "The little cub wishes to negotiate? How charming! Speak then, child. What wisdom do you offer to your new masters?" Kira took a deep breath, drawing on every story of courage and determination that old Bren had ever told her during their long evenings around this same fire. "Release my father, and I'll make you walk away from this valley forever." The silence that followed her words was so complete that the crackling of the fire seemed as loud as thunder. Then Korak began to laugh, a sound so filled with genuine mirth that it brought tears to his eyes. His amusement was quickly joined by the chuckles of his awakening men, creating a chorus of mockery that echoed off the cave walls and seemed to diminish Kira's small figure even further. "You'll make us walk?" Korak repeated between gasps of laughter. "You? A child who barely reaches my knee? Oh, little one, your bravery is admirable, but your understanding of power is sadly lacking." The other raiders had fully awakened now, drawn by the entertainment of watching a child attempt to negotiate with their leader. Their faces showed varying degrees of amusement, condescension, and cruel anticipation of whatever humiliation was about to unfold. "Tell me, tiny warrior," Grax called out mockingly, "exactly how do you plan to accomplish this miracle? Will you challenge us all to combat? Perhaps you have magic powers that we cannot see. Maybe she'll cry until we feel sorry." "For her?" suggested another raider, causing fresh peals of laughter from his companions. Kira felt her cheeks burning with humiliation, but something deeper than embarrassment was driving her now. The sight of her father's bloody face, her mother's terrified eyes, and the casual cruelty of these invaders had awakened something in her young spirit that refused to be cowed by mockery or intimidation. "I don't have magic powers," she said, her voice growing steadier with each word. "But I know who I am, and I know who my father is. Thane is the greatest hunter in 3 valleys, and his daughter doesn't beg from cowards who can only win through trickery and numbers." The laughter began to fade as the raiders realized the child was not backing down despite their ridicule. There was something in her tone, a conviction that seemed too mature for her years, that made even these hardened warriors pause and take notice. Korak's expression grew more serious as he studied Kira with new attention. "Strong words from such a small mouth, but words are just noise in the wind, child. What matters is strength, and you have none." "I have more strength than you think," Kira replied, though her voice now carried a tremor that betrayed her youth and fear. "And I'm not afraid of you, no matter how many of you there are, or how sharp your teeth look." Old Bren, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, slowly began to push himself upright against the cave wall. His movement was careful and deliberate, and something in his bearing caught the attention of both captors and captives alike. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire cave despite its quiet tone. The cave fell into an expectant silence, as old Bren slowly rose to his full height, his walking stick planted firmly against the stone floor for support. Despite his age and the obvious frailty of his weathered body, there was something in his bearing that commanded attention from both friend and foe alike. His graying hair caught the firelight as he turned his deeply lined face toward Korak, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of countless seasons and hard-won wisdom. "The child speaks with the voice of her bloodline," Bren said quietly, his words somehow reaching every corner of the cave despite their gentle tone. 3 generations of her family have defended this valley, and their courage runs in her veins like the stream that feeds our spring. You mock her words because you see only her small size, but size is not the measure of strength that truly matters. Korak's amusement faded as he studied the old man with growing wariness. There was something unsettling about Bren's calm confidence, a quality that suggested knowledge and resources that the raiders had not anticipated. Pretty words from an ancient fool, but words don't sharpen spears or strengthen arms. What can either of you do against 8 warriors in their prime? Bren smiled, an expression that was both gentle and somehow deeply threatening. You assume that strength comes only from muscles and weapons, young raider, but you have lived fewer seasons than I have survived winters. You know the hunger of the body, but not the deeper hungers that drive the actions of bands and leaders. The old man began to move slowly around the fire, his walking stick tapping rhythmically against the stone as he circled the seated raiders. Despite their numerical superiority and ready weapons, several of the warriors shifted uncomfortably under his steady gaze, as if they were children being studied by a disapproving elder rather than conquerors examining a defeated captive. You seek to claim this valley because the drought has made resources scarce, Bren continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller beginning an important tale. But scarcity creates its own rules, its own obligations. Those who take by force alone often find that force is not enough to hold what they have seized. Grax, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the old man's confident demeanor, stood abruptly and pointed his spear at Bren's chest. Enough riddles, old one. Speak plainly or remain silent. Your philosophical words won't change the reality of your situation. But Bren seemed entirely unimpressed by the weapon threatening him. Instead, he continued his slow circuit of the fire, his eyes moving from face to face among the raiders with the intensity of someone reading deeply meaningful symbols. Reality has many layers, young warrior. You see the surface truth, 8 against 3, victory through numbers, the strong taking from the weak. But beneath that surface lie currents that could sweep you away like leaves in a flood. Korak stood as well, his patience finally exhausted by what seemed like meaningless rambling from a defeated old man. Speak clearly, ancient one, or I'll have you silenced permanently. What currents? What threats can you possibly offer from your position of helplessness? Bren stopped his circling and planted his walking stick firmly in front of him, using it to support his weight as he faced the raider leader directly. The flickering firelight cast deep shadows across his lined face, making his expression appear both wise and somehow terrible in its quiet intensity. I offer no threats, he said simply. I speak only of consequences that flow naturally from choices already made. You have taken territory through treachery rather than honest combat. You have bound and humiliated a hunter known throughout the region for his skill and honor. You have terrorized women and children in their own home. These actions create ripples that spread far beyond this cave. The old man's gaze shifted to include each of the raiders in turn, and several of them looked away rather than meet his eyes. Word travels quickly among the scattered bands, carried by traders and hunters who range across vast territories. Stories of cowardice and dishonor spread faster than news of success and strength. What will other bands think when they learn that the Redstone group could only defeat 3 hunters through ambush and overwhelming numbers? An uncomfortable murmur ran through the raiders as the implications of Bren's words began to sink in. In their harsh world, reputation was more valuable than any physical possession, and the respect of other bands was essential for survival during the inevitable times when cooperation and alliance became necessary. More importantly, Bren continued, his voice growing stronger and more compelling with each word, what happens when the other hunters in this region learn that their traditional hunting grounds have been seized by raiders who show no respect for the ancient laws? Do you think they'll simply accept your presence and allow you to hold territory that many of them have used for generations? Korak's confident expression was beginning to show cracks of uncertainty. They can try to challenge us if they wish. We've proven we can defeat any band that opposes us. Have you? Bren asked mildly. You've defeated 3 hunters through trickery when they returned tired from a successful hunt, unaware that enemies waited in their own home. That victory required no great skill or courage. But what happens when 5 bands unite to drive out invaders who threaten the stability of the entire region? The silence that greeted this question was heavy with implications that none of the raiders wanted to consider. They had planned for the conquest of a single valley, not for a war against multiple bands who might see their actions as a threat to the established order. Old Bren straightened to his full height, and despite his obvious age and physical limitations, he suddenly seemed to dominate the entire cave through sheer force of personality and wisdom. The child you mock has offered you a choice that could save your lives and your honor. Release her father. Acknowledge that your conquest was accomplished through dishonorable means, and leave this valley to seek territory through legitimate challenge and fair combat. Do this, and you might still salvage your reputations and your futures. Kira watched in amazement as the old man she had always seen as gentle and scholarly revealed hidden depths of strength and authority that even these hardened raiders could not ignore. His words carried the weight of truth and consequence, painting a picture of potential disaster that made their easy victory seem far more dangerous than they had realized. The choice is yours, Korak of the Redstone Band, Bren concluded, his voice carrying finality like the closing of a great stone door. But choose quickly, before the ripples of your actions spread so far that no choice remains except to face the consequences of what you have set in motion. The effect of Bren's words rippled through the gathered raiders like stones thrown into still water. Kira could see the uncertainty beginning to creep into their faces as they exchanged glances, their earlier confidence shaken by the old man's calm recitation of potential consequences. What had seemed like a simple conquest was now revealing complications that none of them had anticipated. Corvin, one of the younger raiders whose scarred hands marked him as an experienced fighter, was the first to voice the doubts that several of them were clearly feeling. Korak, he said hesitantly, the Old One speaks of things we hadn't considered. What if the other bands truly do unite against us? We're strong, but not strong enough to fight the entire region. Superstitious nonsense, Korak replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. His eyes kept returning to Bren's weathered face, as if searching for signs of deception or weakness that would allow him to dismiss the Elder's warnings as empty threats. Old men always speak of consequences and ancient laws when they lack the strength to enforce their will directly. But even as their leader spoke, more of the raiders were beginning to show signs of unease. Drac, whose massive frame rivaled even Grom's impressive size, shifted his weight nervously as he considered the implications of Bren's words. My cousin's band ranges in the Eastern Territories. They respect strength, but they also honor the old ways of challenge and combat. If word spreads that we took territory through trickery, then we'll deal with whatever comes, Korak snapped, his growing irritation evident in his sharp tone. We didn't survive the drought by worrying about what other bands might think of our methods. We survived by being stronger and smarter than our enemies. Grax, who had been silent during most of the exchange, finally spoke up with obvious reluctance. The old man knows things, Korak. Look at how he speaks, how he carries himself. This isn't just an ordinary elder spouting tribal wisdom. There's knowledge here that might be valuable, and enemies we haven't considered. The fire crackled and hissed as a log shifted, sending sparks spiraling up toward the cave ceiling. In the dancing light, Thane remained motionless against the wall, his hunter's instincts telling him to remain perfectly still while his captors debated among themselves. But Kira could see the alertness in his eyes as he watched for any opportunity that might arise from the growing dissension in the raiders' ranks. Old Bren seemed to sense the wavering resolve among some of the invaders, and he pressed his advantage with the skill of someone who had spent decades reading the hearts and minds of his fellow human beings. You are all experienced hunters and warriors, he said, his tone respectful rather than mocking. You understand that the most dangerous prey is not always the largest or the most obviously threatening. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from underestimating what seems weak or harmless. He gestured toward Kira, who still stood defiantly near the fire, despite the terror that made her small hands tremble. This child offered to make you leave this valley. You laughed at her words because you see only her size and age. But she is the daughter of a legendary hunter, raised in a bloodline that has never yielded its territory to invaders. Her courage comes from something deeper than physical strength. Korak's patience was clearly nearing its end, but several of his followers were listening to Bren's words with growing attention. The old man's calm confidence was beginning to work on their imaginations, planting seeds of doubt about whether their easy victory might prove to be a trap disguised as triumph. Moreover, Bren continued, his voice taking on the hypnotic quality of a master storyteller, you assume that this cave holds only what you can see, but we have lived here for 3 generations, through droughts and floods, through invasions and internal conflicts. Do you truly believe we would have survived so long without resources and preparations that go beyond the obvious? This question struck at the heart of every warrior's deepest fear, the possibility that they had walked into a situation they didn't fully understand, that their enemies possessed advantages or capabilities that hadn't been immediately apparent. In their harsh world, such oversights could prove fatal. Breck, another of the raiders whose nervous energy had been growing throughout the conversation, finally voiced what several of them were thinking. "What resources? What preparations? If you're threatening us, old man, speak plainly." Bren smiled enigmatically, neither confirming nor denying the implications of his words. "I threaten no one. I simply observe that hasty actions often produce unexpected results. A valley that has been successfully defended for 3 generations might possess defensive capabilities that aren't immediately visible to newcomers." The psychological effect of this suggestion was immediate and powerful. Several of the raiders began glancing around the cave with new wariness, as if expecting hidden threats to emerge from the shadows. Their confidence, which had seemed unshakable when they had captured the 3 hunters through superior numbers, was now being eroded by the possibility that they had missed something crucial in their assessment of the situation. Korak could see the doubt spreading among his men, and his frustration erupted into anger. "Enough of these word games," he snarled, raising his spear threateningly toward Bren. "If you have traps or weapons or allies hidden in this cursed cave, then reveal them now. Otherwise, admit that you're simply an old fool trying to frighten us with empty riddles." But before Bren could respond, young Kira stepped forward again, her small form moving between the raider leader's weapon and the elderly man who had become her unexpected champion. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a conviction that seemed far beyond her 7 years. "You want proof," she said, her eyes blazing with determination that made even Korak hesitate. "Then accept my father's challenge to single combat. If you're truly the strongest, prove it through honest fighting instead of hiding behind your numbers like a coward who fears to face a real warrior." The challenge hung in the air between them, simple and direct in a way that cut through all the psychological maneuvering and brought the conflict back to its most basic elements: honor against pragmatism, courage against caution, the old ways against the new realities of a world made desperate by scarcity and hardship. And in that moment of crystallized tension, Kira could see something shift in the faces of the raiders, a recognition that perhaps the real test of their strength was not whether they could hold what they had taken, but whether they possessed the courage to risk losing it in fair combat. Kira's challenge echoed off the cave walls like a thunderclap, and in the silence that followed, she could hear the rapid beating of her own heart. Every pair of eyes in the cave was fixed on her small figure, as she stood between Korak's threatening spear and old Bren's steady presence. The raider leader's scarred face showed a mixture of anger and something that might have been grudging respect for the child's unexpected courage. "Single combat," Korak repeated slowly, as if testing the words for hidden meanings. His filed teeth caught the firelight as he considered the implications of accepting such a challenge. Around him, his followers watched with expressions that revealed their own internal conflicts between pragmatic caution and warrior pride. Thane, still bound against the cave wall, felt his heart swell with both pride and terror at his daughter's boldness. She was offering him a chance to fight for their freedom, but she was also placing herself at the center of a deadly game that could result in his death and her family's permanent enslavement. Yet he could not deny the fierce satisfaction he felt at seeing his bloodline's courage manifest in such a dramatic moment. "The child speaks like a true daughter of hunters," Grax admitted reluctantly, his weathered face showing the conflict between admiration and tactical concerns. "But accepting such a challenge, it changes everything. If Korak fights and loses, we lose our claim to this territory. If he fights and wins, we validate the very traditions we came here to ignore." Drac nodded his massive head in agreement. "The old ways have power, even when we try to abandon them. Other bands will judge us based on whether we honor the ancient challenges or continue to rely purely on numbers and surprise." Korak's grip tightened on his spear as he felt the weight of leadership pressing down upon him. The decision he made in the next few moments would determine not only the fate of this particular conflict, but also his band's reputation throughout the region for seasons to come. In their harsh world, a leader's credibility was often more valuable than any territory or resource. "You speak of honor and ancient ways," he said finally, his voice carrying the strain of someone wrestling with competing impulses. "But these are desperate times. The drought has forced changes in how we must live and survive. Perhaps some traditions are luxuries we can no longer afford." Old Bren stepped forward slightly, his walking stick tapping against the stone floor with deliberate rhythm. Desperation makes choices harder, young leader, but it doesn't change their fundamental nature. A band that abandons honor in pursuit of survival often discovers that survival without honor is merely a longer form of death. The old man's words struck at the heart of every warrior's deepest beliefs about what it meant to be a leader worthy of following. In their world, where physical strength was essential but not sufficient, the respect and loyalty of followers depended heavily on maintaining certain standards of conduct that distinguished civilized bands from mere raiders and scavengers. Corvin, whose earlier doubts had been the first crack in the raiders' unified confidence, spoke up again with obvious reluctance. My grandfather used to say that a victory won through dishonor creates more enemies than defeat faced with courage. Maybe we should consider what the child offers. Are you suggesting we risk everything on single combat? Korak demanded, his frustration beginning to show more clearly. We have these people defeated. Their territory is ours to claim. Why throw away certain victory for the sake of outdated traditions? But even as he spoke the words, Korak could see that several of his followers were no longer entirely convinced by the logic of pure pragmatism. The combination of Bren's psychological pressure and Kira's unexpected courage had created doubt where none had existed before, forcing them to confront the difference between winning and earning a victory that would be respected by other bands. Breck, whose nervous energy had been growing throughout the evening, finally voiced what others were thinking. What if the old man is right about the consequences? What if holding this territory through trickery brings down the wrath of multiple bands? We might win this valley only to lose everything else. The firelight danced across their faces as the raiders struggled with questions that had no easy answers. They had come seeking simple conquest, but now found themselves confronting complex issues of honor, reputation, and long-term survival that their leader's pragmatic approach had not adequately considered. Thane, sensing the moment's importance, spoke for the first time since his capture. His voice was hoarse from his earlier beating, but it carried the authority of someone who had faced death many times and emerged victorious through skill and courage rather than treachery. Korak, he said, his words carrying across the cave despite his bound position. You call yourself a leader, but leadership requires more than the ability to count warriors and plan ambushes. A true leader inspires loyalty through actions that his followers can respect and emulate. What kind of loyalty can you command from men who know their success depends on avoiding fair fights? The question struck home with brutal effectiveness. Several of the raiders shifted uncomfortably, their expressions showing that Thane's words had touched on doubts they had been trying to suppress. They were experienced warriors who took pride in their fighting abilities, and the implication that they had become mere bullies hiding behind superior numbers challenged their self-image in fundamental ways. Kira watched the play of emotions across the raiders' faces and realized that her desperate challenge had succeeded in creating exactly the kind of internal conflict that old Bren had been working toward. The invaders were no longer united in their certainty, and that division represented her family's best hope for survival and freedom. My father has never lost a single combat, she said, her young voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. Not against the great cave bear that threatened the western settlements, not against the rival hunter who challenged him for leadership of our band, not against the wolf pack that cornered him in the narrow canyon. If you're truly the strongest, prove it in fair combat. If you're just another coward who can only win through numbers and surprise, then admit it and live with the shame. The insult was delivered with the innocent directness of childhood, but its impact was devastating. Korak's face flushed with anger at being called a coward by a 7-year-old child, while his followers watched to see how their leader would respond to such a public challenge to his courage and competence. Enough, Korak growled, his patience finally exhausted. You want single combat? You want to see which of us is truly stronger? He turned toward Thane with predatory intensity. Very well, legendary hunter. Tomorrow at dawn, we settle this the old way. If you defeat me, my band leaves your territory and acknowledges your right to remain. If I defeat you, he let the implications hang unspoken in the air, but everyone present understood the stakes. Victory would mean freedom for Kira's family and validation of the ancient traditions. Defeat would mean death for Thane and permanent subjugation for those he left behind. The die was cast, and there could be no turning back from the path that a child's courage had opened before them. The first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern ridge, painting the valley floor in shades of gold and shadow, that seemed to emphasize the gravity of what was about to unfold. Kira had not slept during the long night, instead spending the dark hours pressed against her mother's side, listening to the quiet conversations of the raiders as they debated among themselves the wisdom of their leader's decision to accept the challenge. Thane sat in meditation against the cave wall, his bonds having been loosened enough to allow circulation, but not enough to permit escape. His breathing was deep and controlled, the rhythm of a warrior preparing his mind and body for combat that would determine not only his own fate but the future of everyone he loved. Despite the cuts and bruises from his capture, his eyes held the focused intensity of a hunter who had sighted his prey. Old Bren had spent much of the night tending to Thane's wounds, as much as his restraints would allow, using his knowledge of healing herbs and techniques to ensure the hunter would be in the best possible condition for the coming fight. His weathered hands worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning cuts and applying poultices that would reduce swelling and ease the stiffness of bruised muscles. "The shoulder will be tender," Bren whispered quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the dying fire. "Favor your left side in the early exchanges until the joint warms properly. Korak is younger and less experienced, but he's fresh while you carry yesterday's damage." Thane nodded his understanding, grateful for the elder's wisdom and care. "What do you know of his fighting style?" "I saw little during the capture except that he relies on strength over finesse." "He fights like a young bull," Bren replied softly. "Powerful charges, overwhelming force, but limited patience for extended combat. If you can weather his initial assault and force the fight to continue beyond his preferred duration, his inexperience with prolonged battles may give you the advantage." As the morning light grew stronger, Korak stirred from his position near the fire and began preparing for the combat with ritualistic care. His weapons and armor, such as it was in their primitive time, were examined and adjusted with the attention to detail that marked a warrior who understood that small advantages often determined the outcome of evenly matched fights. The other raiders formed a loose circle around their leader, offering advice and encouragement that revealed their own mixed feelings about the approaching duel. Some spoke with confidence about Korak's strength and skill, but others seemed troubled by the honorable nature of their opposition and the implications of what defeat might mean for their band's future. "Remember that he's older," Grax advised, checking the leather bindings that secured Korak's stone knife to his belt. "Age brings experience, but it also brings slower reflexes and reduced stamina. Press him hard from the beginning and don't allow him time to settle into his rhythm." Drac, despite his earlier expressions of doubt about their methods, remained loyal to his leader. "You've never lost a single combat, Korak. Today won't be different. The hunter may have reputation, but reputation doesn't sharpen spears or strengthen arms." When the sun had risen far enough to illuminate the flat area of ground that would serve as their fighting arena, Korak stood and addressed his followers with the formal words that preceded such encounters. "Witness this combat between Korak of the Redstone Band and Thane of the Valley people. Let it be conducted according to the ancient laws, with honor on both sides and acceptance of whatever outcome the fight determines." Thane was unbound and allowed to prepare himself, his movements careful as he tested the range of motion in his injured shoulder and assessed the condition of his body after the night of captivity. Despite the disadvantage of his recent wounds, his bearing showed no sign of uncertainty or fear, only the focused determination of a hunter who had tracked dangerous prey across impossible terrain. Kira watched from beside her mother as her father selected his weapons for the fight, his primary spear, newly sharpened to razor keenness, and a backup knife of black stone that had been crafted by his own father many seasons ago. The weight and balance of these tools was familiar to him from countless hunts and previous combats, and their presence seemed to restore some of his natural confidence. "Are you ready, hunter?" Korak called across the makeshift arena, his own spear held with practiced ease. The morning air was crisp and still, perfect conditions for a fight that would test every aspect of skill, strength, and endurance that both warriors possessed. Thane stepped into the circle marked by the watching crowd, his movements betraying none of the stiffness he surely felt from his injuries. "I am ready, Raider. Let us discover which of us truly deserves to call this valley home." The two men began to circle each other with the cautious respect that experienced fighters showed for dangerous opponents. Each studied the other's stance, weapon handling, and movement patterns, looking for weaknesses or habits that might provide tactical advantages in the exchanges to come. Old Bren positioned himself where he could observe both fighters clearly, his role as witness and judge accepted by both sides, despite his obvious allegiance to Thane's family. In his weathered hands, he held a staff that would mark the beginning and end of the combat, along with his authority to call halt if either fighter was defeated but not yet dead. "Let the combat begin," Bren called out, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "May the stronger warrior prevail, and may honor be served regardless of the outcome." The staff struck the ground with finality, and two of the most skilled fighters in the region launched themselves toward each other, with the explosive violence of predators competing for territory. Spear points flashed in the morning sunlight as the deadly dance began, each warrior testing the other's defenses while searching for the opening that would decide their fates. Korak attacked with the brutal directness that Bren had predicted, his powerful frame driving his spear toward Thane's chest with enough force to penetrate even thick hide armor. But the older hunter's experience showed immediately as he deflected the thrust with minimal movement, using Korak's momentum against him while positioning himself for a counterattack. The fight had begun in earnest, and Kira held her breath as she watched her father engage in the most important battle of his life, a combat that would determine whether courage and skill could triumph over youth and strength, and whether a child's desperate challenge could truly change the fate of those she loved most. The initial exchange between the two warriors was explosive and brief, their spears meeting with a sharp crack that echoed off the valley walls like breaking stone. Korak's greater youth and size advantage was immediately apparent as he pressed forward with relentless aggression, his attacks coming in powerful waves that forced Thane to give ground while searching for opportunities to counter. But what the raider leader possessed in raw strength, Thane matched with superior technique and the kind of tactical intelligence that came from decades of hunting the most dangerous prey in the region. Where Korak attacked with brutal directness, Thane responded with subtle deflections and redirections that turned his opponent's power against him, causing the younger warrior to expend energy without achieving decisive results. Kira watched with her heart hammering against her ribs as her father fought for their family's survival. Every thrust of Korak's spear seemed to carry the potential for catastrophe, while every defensive movement by Thane required perfect timing and placement to avoid disaster. The margin for error was so small that a single mistake by either fighter could end the combat instantly. The circling crowd of raiders and captives followed the action with intense concentration, each person present understanding that they were witnessing a battle that would be remembered and retold for generations. This was no mere territorial dispute, but a clash between different philosophies of leadership and survival, with honor and tradition struggling against pragmatism and opportunism. "Press him harder," Grax called out to his leader, though whether from genuine tactical advice or growing nervousness was unclear. "Don't let the old hunter find his rhythm." But Korak needed no encouragement to maintain his aggressive approach. His filed teeth were bared in a predatory grin as he launched another series of attacks, his spear work showing the fluid competence of someone who had survived many such encounters. The red ochre markings on his face and arms seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, giving him an almost supernatural appearance as he fought. Thane absorbed the pressure with the patience of an experienced hunter, his movements economical and precise as he waited for the opening he knew would come. His injured shoulder was clearly affecting his mobility, but his years of experience allowed him to compensate by positioning himself to minimize the disadvantage while maximizing the effectiveness of his counterattacks. The first significant exchange came when Korak overextended himself in an attempt to end the fight quickly. His spear thrust carried all his considerable strength, but when Thane sidestepped at the last possible moment, the raider's momentum carried him past his target and exposed his flank to retaliation. Thane's counterstrike opened a shallow but bleeding cut along Korak's ribs, drawing the first blood of the combat. The wound was minor, but its psychological impact was substantial. Korak's confident expression flickered, with the first hint of uncertainty, as he realized that his opponent was more dangerous than anticipated. The watching raiders shifted nervously, their earlier confidence in their leader's inevitable victory now tempered by the evidence that this would not be the easy conquest they had expected. "First blood to the hunter," Old Bren announced formally, his voice carrying the authority of his role as witness and judge. "The combat continues until one warrior yields or can no longer fight." Korak touched his wounded side briefly, his fingers coming away red with blood. Rather than discouraging him, the injury seemed to awaken something fiercer in his nature. His attacks resumed with renewed intensity, but now they carried a desperate edge that suggested he understood the stakes were higher than he had originally calculated. The two warriors settled into the deadly rhythm of extended combat, their spears weaving patterns of attack and defense that required constant vigilance and split-second timing. Both men were breathing heavily now, their initial reserves of energy depleted by the intensity of their exchanges and the constant tension of mortal combat. Thane's experience began to show more clearly as the fight continued. Where Korak was gradually becoming more reckless in his attacks, driven by the need to achieve quick victory before his stamina failed, the older hunter maintained his tactical discipline and waited for his opportunities with predatory patience. The decisive moment came when Korak attempted a powerful overhead strike that would have split Thane's skull if it had connected. But the attack was telegraphed by the raider's earlier pattern of movements, and Thane was ready for it. Instead of retreating or attempting to block the blow directly, he stepped inside Korak's reach while the spear was still descending, bringing his own weapon up in a thrust that penetrated his opponent's defenses. Korak's eyes widened in shock as he felt the stone point of Thane's spear pierce his chest, sliding between his ribs to find the vital organs beneath. The power went out of his attack as pain and the realization of defeat overwhelmed his senses, and his own spear fell harmlessly to the ground as his strength fled. The watching crowd fell into stunned silence as their mighty leader swayed on his feet, blood beginning to flow from the mortal wound. Korak looked down at the spear protruding from his chest with an expression of disbelief, as if unable to accept that his conquest of the valley had ended in his own destruction. "It is finished," old Bren declared, his voice carrying across the sudden quiet with the finality of judgment. "Thane of the Valley people has defeated Korak of the Redstone Band in honest combat. The ancient laws have been satisfied, and the outcome must be honored by all who witnessed it." Thane withdrew his spear with careful precision, allowing the defeated raider to collapse to his knees as his life's blood soaked into the earth of the valley he had tried to claim. There was no cruelty in the hunter's expression, only the grim satisfaction of a warrior who had protected what mattered most to him through skill and determination. Kira felt her legs go weak with relief and overwhelming emotion as she realized that her desperate challenge had ultimately succeeded. Her father had proven his superiority in the ancient way, and the raiders who had seemed so invincible just moments before now stood defeated and leaderless, their conquest reduced to failure and death. But even as victory settled over the valley, she could see in the faces of the surviving raiders that this resolution, while decisive, would bring its own complications and consequences that none of them had fully anticipated. The silence that followed Korak's death stretched across the valley like a heavy blanket, broken only by the labored breathing of the exhausted victor and the soft whisper of wind through the scattered trees. Thane stood over his fallen opponent, his chest rising and falling with the deep rhythm of someone who had pushed his body to its absolute limits, while blood from his reopened wounds traced dark lines down his weathered skin. The 7 surviving raiders stared at their leader's motionless form with expressions that ranged from shock to grief to barely concealed fear. In the span of a few heartbeats, their entire world had been transformed from conquest to defeat, from predators to potential prey. Without Korak's commanding presence to unify them, they were no longer a cohesive warband, but merely a collection of individual fighters facing an uncertain future. Grax was the first to speak, his voice hoarse with emotion as he knelt beside his fallen leader. "Korak, he was the strongest among us. How could he fall to an injured hunter past his prime?" The question was directed as much to himself as to his companions, a desperate attempt to understand how their seemingly inevitable victory had turned to catastrophic defeat. "Because strength alone is never enough," old Bren replied gently, his weathered voice carrying the patience of someone who had witnessed many such reversals of fortune. "Your leader was indeed powerful, but power without wisdom is like a stone tool without proper balance, dangerous to wield effectively. Thane won because he fought with both strength and intelligence, while Korak relied too heavily on force alone. Drak, whose massive frame seemed somehow diminished by the loss of his leader, struggled to his feet and faced Thane with obvious reluctance. The combat was fought according to the ancient laws, and the outcome cannot be disputed. You have proven your right to this territory, Hunter. What happens to us now?" The question hung in the morning air with all the weight of life and death decisions. According to the traditions that had governed such conflicts for countless generations, Thane would have been within his rights to demand the deaths of the surviving raiders as payment for their attempted conquest. Alternatively, he could claim them as slaves or demand tribute that would effectively impoverish their band for seasons to come. But as Kira watched her father consider his options, she saw something in his expression that spoke of the deeper wisdom that had always marked him as more than just a skilled hunter. Thane understood that true victory required more than just defeating enemies. It required creating a resolution that would bring lasting peace rather than merely setting the stage for future revenge and conflict. "You came to my valley seeking territory and resources," Thane said finally, his voice still rough from the exertion of combat, but carrying the authority of undisputed victory. "The drought has made all our lives harder, and desperate bands do desperate things. I understand the pressures that drove you to this choice, even if I cannot approve of your methods." He gestured toward the body of their fallen leader, his expression grave but not without compassion. Korak was a warrior of considerable skill, and he died with honor in fair combat. That death has paid the price for your band's transgression against the ancient laws. You are free to return to your own territories without further punishment, but with the understanding that any future approach to this valley must be made in peace and with respect for our established rights. The relief that flooded through the surviving raiders was visible in their posture and expressions, but it was tempered by the practical reality of their situation. Without their leader, their band's future was uncertain, and the loss of Korak's strength and leadership would make their struggle for survival in the drought-stricken region significantly more difficult. Corvin, who had been among the first to express doubts about their leader's methods, stepped forward with obvious hesitation. "You offer us mercy when tradition would allow vengeance. Why? What do you gain from showing such kindness to enemies who threatened your family?" Thane's smile was tired but genuine as he considered the young warrior's question. "I gain the possibility of peace rather than the certainty of future conflict. If I kill you all or drive you into desperation, your surviving relatives and allies will eventually come seeking revenge. But if I show that strength can be combined with wisdom and mercy, perhaps other bands will remember this example when they face their own difficult choices." Old Bren nodded his approval of Thane's decision, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of someone whose faith in human nature had been validated. True leadership creates more leaders, not more corpses. By showing mercy after victory, Thane demonstrates the kind of strength that builds lasting peace rather than temporary dominance. Kira felt a surge of pride in her father that went beyond mere relief at their survival. She had always known him as a skilled hunter and loving parent, but today she had seen him reveal depths of wisdom and character that marked him as truly worthy of the respect he commanded throughout the region. Mira stepped forward to embrace her husband, her relief and joy evident in every line of her body as she finally allowed herself to believe that their ordeal was truly over. "You fought like the great hunters of legend," she whispered against his ear, her voice thick with emotion. "Kira's courage gave you the opportunity, but your skill and honor won our freedom." As the morning sun climbed higher and began to warm the valley, the surviving raiders gathered their few possessions and prepared to begin the long journey back to their home territories. They moved with the subdued manner of warriors who had learned hard lessons about the difference between conquest and victory, between taking territory and earning the right to hold it. Grax approached Thane one final time, his scarred face showing an emotion that might have been respect. "You could have demanded our deaths or our servitude, Hunter. Instead, you offer us the chance to rebuild our band with honor intact. This mercy will not be forgotten, either by us or by those who hear the tale of today's combat. See that it is remembered as a story of honor restored rather than conquest achieved," Thane replied. "Let other bands know that the ancient laws still have power, and that strength guided by wisdom creates better outcomes than force alone." As the defeated raiders disappeared into the distance, Kira found herself reflecting on the strange chain of events that had transformed her desperate challenge into a victory that none of them could have predicted. Her small voice had somehow initiated a series of actions that had restored her family's freedom and demonstrated that courage, even in a child, could change the fate of nations. But she also understood, with the intuitive wisdom that sometimes comes to the young, that this victory carried its own responsibilities, and that the lessons learned in this valley would ripple outward to influence many other lives in ways they could not yet imagine. 3 days had passed since the combat that had restored peace to the valley, and life was slowly returning to its familiar rhythms. Thane's wounds were healing well under Old Bren's careful attention, though he would carry the scars of that desperate fight for the rest of his life. The cave felt like home again, no longer contaminated by the presence of unwelcome invaders, but somehow changed by everything that had transpired within its sheltering walls. Kira sat on a sun-warmed boulder outside the cave entrance, watching her father work on repairs to their damaged belongings, while her mother prepared the morning meal over their restored fire. The normalcy of these activities brought comfort, but she found herself frequently lost in thought about the extraordinary events that had begun with her desperate challenge to warriors who had seemed utterly invincible. "You're thinking deep thoughts, little spark," Thane observed, settling beside her with a slight wince that betrayed his lingering injuries. His weathered hands continued their work on the spear shaft he was straightening, but his attention was focused entirely on his daughter. "Would you like to share what occupies your mind so seriously?" Kira was quiet for a long moment, struggling to put her complex emotions into words that could adequately express what she was feeling. "I was so scared when I spoke to Korak," she admitted finally, her small voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the valley. "My hands were shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to burst from beating so fast, but I couldn't just watch them hurt our family without doing something, even if it seemed impossible." Thane set down his work and placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, his touch conveying more comfort and understanding than any words could have achieved. "Fear doesn't make you weak, Kira. Everyone who faces truly dangerous situations feels afraid. The difference between cowards and heroes lies not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to act correctly despite that fear." "But I'm just a child," Kira protested, her young mind still struggling to understand how her small actions could have had such profound consequences. "How could my words possibly matter against 8 armed warriors who could have killed us all without even breathing hard?" Old Bren approached them slowly, his walking stick tapping against the stone as he made his way to join their conversation. His weathered face bore the gentle smile that always appeared when he was about to share one of his teaching stories, and both Thane and Kira turned their attention to him with the automatic respect accorded to wisdom and experience. "Little one," Bren began, settling carefully onto a nearby stone with the deliberate movements of advanced age, "do you remember the story I told you about the great avalanche that blocked the mountain pass 3 winters ago?" Kira nodded, though she wasn't sure where the old man was leading with this particular tale. That avalanche, which moved boulders larger than our cave and blocked a passage that had been used for countless generations, was started by a single pebble that rolled loose from its place on the mountainside. One tiny stone, no larger than what you could hold in your palm, set in motion forces that changed the landscape forever. The elder's eyes, bright with intelligence despite their age, fixed on Kira's face with gentle intensity. "Your courage that night was like that pebble, child, small in itself, but powerful enough to set larger forces into motion. Your willingness to stand up to those who seemed invincible gave the rest of us permission to remember our own strength and dignity." Mira looked up from her cooking, her face showing the maternal pride that had been growing stronger with each day since their ordeal ended. "Without your brave words, we might have simply accepted our fate as captives. You reminded us all that surrender was not the only choice available, even when the odds seemed hopeless. More than that," Thane added, his voice carrying the respect that one warrior might show to another, "you forced Korak to confront his own fears about honor and reputation. Your challenge made it impossible for him to ignore the doubts that some of his own followers were already feeling about their methods." Kira absorbed these words with the seriousness that children sometimes bring to concepts that adults take for granted. She was beginning to understand that courage was not the absence of fear, but rather the decision to act righteously despite overwhelming terror. This realization brought with it both pride in what she had accomplished and a deeper understanding of the responsibilities that came with such knowledge. "Will other bands hear about what happened here?" she asked, her young mind already grasping some of the implications of their victory's broader significance. "Stories travel fast among our scattered people," Bren replied with certainty. "Hunters and traders will carry the tale of Thane's combat and the child who initiated it to every settlement and camp within many days' travel. Some will hear it as a story of victory achieved through skill and honor, others as an example of mercy shown to defeated enemies." "And what will they learn from it?" Kira pressed, sensing that there were lessons here that went far beyond their family's personal survival. Thane considered his answer carefully before responding. "They will learn that the ancient ways still have power when they are applied with wisdom and courage. That strength without honor creates only temporary victories, while strength combined with mercy can create lasting peace. Most importantly, they will learn that even the smallest voice can change the course of great events when it speaks the truth at the crucial moment. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western ridge, painting the valley in the same golden light that had witnessed their victory, Kira felt a deep sense of completion settling over her young heart. The terror and desperation of 3 days ago seemed like distant memories now, replaced by a quiet confidence in her own worth and capabilities that would remain with her for the rest of her life. "I think I understand now," she said quietly, her words carrying a maturity that surprised even those who had witnessed her transformation from frightened child to courageous challenger. Sometimes the most important battles are not fought with spears and strength, but with words, and the willingness to stand up for what we know is right, even when we're afraid. Old Bren's smile broadened with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student has grasped a fundamental truth. "Exactly so, little one. And now you carry that knowledge with you always, along with the understanding that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above their valley, Kira settled between her parents beside the fire that had always been the heart of their home. The familiar sounds and smells of their evening routine brought comfort and contentment, but underneath those simple pleasures lay a deeper satisfaction, the knowledge that when the greatest test of her young life had come, she had found within herself the courage to speak truth to power, and, in doing so, had changed not only her family's fate, but potentially the future of all who would hear their story. The prehistoric valley that had witnessed so much drama and conflict was once again peaceful, but it was a peace built on foundations of honor, courage, and wisdom that would endure far longer than any conquest achieved through force alone. And in the heart of one small girl burned the quiet flame of understanding that would guide her through whatever challenges the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that she possessed the inner strength to face any trial with dignity and hope.